It's time for another answer to the question that I asked in my Facebook group about what is something you wish more people would know about the art or style that you practice. And this was the response that I got from Zachariah. And he said, the move that looks absolutely ridiculous when taught at half power and in isolation, it's scary as hell when applied with power. There's been a long standing debate in martial arts and self-defense circles about training intensity. The debate centers around, do you need to pull your punches and in that way falsify the training a little bit or a lot, depending on your point of view? Or should you go full contact with techniques because that's the only way to approach reality? For me, the debate is kind of silly because there's no one right answer. It depends is maybe the best answer. What does that mean? Well, if you do force on force training in law enforcement or other violence professional training, what you'll see is, for instance, firearms training, where they will use simulations, which hurts when you get hit, but isn't lethal. Well, that's not real life. You are using typically, your own firearm with the barrel replaced with so that you can fire the simulations. But the point is that it's still not real life. You don't get killed when somebody hits you with simulations, but it does hurt, and that's kind of the goal. As a friend of mine said, is that the purpose is that it should hurt. You should have a physical response and, for instance, fight through it, not just give up once you get hit, but keep going, because that's the mindset that you want to instill in training. So that's one thing. But nobody is using live rounds in those simulation trainings or doing something similar. You're not shooting at each other with live rounds. Why? Because then people die. It defeats the purpose of training. Same applies when you do, for instance, free training or sparring with edged weapons. People use training weapons, training knives, plastics, other kind of simulated blades, but not the real thing. Why? Well, because otherwise you get stabbed, you get cut, and people die. So this whole idea of you absolutely need to go hardcore with your training is not entirely correct. That there's just no way you can replicate reality completely by adding more intensity and more contact. Now, on the other hand, there's a lot of people who misunderstand what it's like to actually hit somebody, strike, do your techniques for real, if they don't have any experience at all throwing something, throwing a technique at an actual opponent and landing it, what it's like. It's not the same as punching the air and shadow boxing. So that is one aspect of the equation. The other aspect is that people always reframe, in my opinion, incorrectly, this aspect towards, well, if your techniques are so lethal, why don't you go do an MMA match and prove it there? It's beyond the scope. It's non-argument. Go to MMA matches and you will see that there is, and this is me talking as an MMA coach, there are a bunch of rules or fouls, depending on how they call it in the rules and regulations, things that you're not allowed to do. Does that mean that if you were to be able to do these things in an MMA match, you would by default beat the other guy? Of course not. That makes zero sense. There is no one super technique that you can use that beats anybody at any time, any place, regardless of skill level, weight classes, and so on. Just because you know supposedly dangerous technique doesn't mean you'll beat a guy who's only using MMA approved techniques on you. So that doesn't make any sense. What is true is that certain things aren't allowed in, for instance, MMA, which is like eye pokes. And immediately somebody here will talk about, well, John Jones made a career out of it. I'm not going to go into that, but the point is that you regularly see fighters stop fighting as soon as they get poked in the eye. Now, yes, there's a part of that which is using the rule sets to their advantage, so that when they get an eye poke, that they can take a break. The referee steps in and pauses the fight until they recover. Yes, but you're not allowed to consciously target the eyes in an MMA bout. So that changes things. One of the things that it changes is that you don't necessarily have to worry about certain techniques because they're not allowed. Finger jabs to the eyes are not allowed. There's this viral video from several years ago in which I think it was an American Marine having a fight against, I think he was a Filipino soldier, and they were like gonna go at it, and the Marine basically, well, I think it was a Marine, but the American soldier just did a really quick eye poke, and the fight was over. One technique, fight was over. So when you look at this whole discussion, it doesn't make sense to me to reduce it to either or. It's not binary. The third aspect that I want to mention is that it depends on context. What are you doing in which context? Certain things are just not appropriate for one context, but are very much so for another. And then another aspect is also it comes down to experience and specific knowledge of a style or a system. Just because something doesn't exist in what you do in your style of fighting doesn't mean that it can't work. I mean, the biggest way that you can actually end up going into a dead-end street in your training is dismissing everything that doesn't fit your idea of what fighting should be like. So let's look at a few examples. Like when you look at it happen slowly, it just looks like crap. One of these examples is shearing impacts, shearing forces. And this is something that I learned from Bob Orlando's Kuntao. There's a technique that I called clapping dust. And it's basically, Bob explained it, it's like the pizza maker is clapping the dust off his hands. And it's a similar motion that you do on your partner or your training partner and your attacker in real life. When you do it, you basically rotate the head in different directions. Now, shearing forces means that you have two different forces moving along parallel lines, but in opposing directions. What is stuck in between these two forces is going to take the impact, and it's going to hurt. And this clapping dust technique is one of them. Now, when you see me do it, or you saw Bob do it, it doesn't look like much at all. However, it's a technique that can work really well from close by, put a lot of stress on the cervical spine. And the way it works is that it uses shearing forces, but it also uses the idea of using the strength of your opponent against him. Meaning, if you hit his face so it turns one way, he instinctively wants to turn it back. And that's when you hit the other direction, in the other direction, and make it worse for him as opposed to if he hadn't moved his head. So you have this rapid twisting and torquing of the cervical spine, which hurts quite a bit. I showed this on during a private seminar to somebody who was totally new to martial arts, and I was holding back very much, and he did not appreciate it at all, meaning that it hurt quite a bit, and that was me holding back. Now, when you look at an MMA match, you're like, it's never going to work. Of course not. It's not meant to be used against somebody who has his guard up high and who is ready to go and fight and already in that position. It can be used in different circumstances, in techniques that you will not encounter in an MMA match, but you will regularly see in self-defense situations where the people are not necessarily trained athletes. So that's one example. The other example that I like to give is a two-finger whip strike, meaning it's like a back fist, but instead of using your fist and the knuckles of your fist, you use your fingers, the index and the middle finger. It looks like total crap when you see me do it relaxed. And even if I go fast, it just looks stupid. It looks like it will never hurt. The key of the technique is it allows you to develop a lot of speed, because a back fist is a relatively fast technique. Difficult to put power in there, especially at first when you learn it, but it is really good for speed. Now, using the two-finger whip variation, the goal of that is you only use it against soft targets. Typically, you go for the eye, you go for one specific eye, and you try to get the knuckles of your index finger and middle finger, the middle part, the middle knuckles of the fingers, you basically try to get them into the eye socket, hitting the eye. And then it has to do with the way that the eye is basically this gelatinous form shape, and the way that impact travels through such an object and so on to create a lot of damage to that eye. And then it has to do with the way that the optical nerve is connected to the brain and how attacking the optical nerve influences the brain. Now, the second way of landing the technique is hitting the side of the neck and trying to go for the arteries. This one is a little bit different. You have to hit a little bit deeper into the target. So again, it takes specialized training, but I've demonstrated this numerous times with students and with people who dismiss the ID as being a ridiculous technique. And they all get the same thing when I do it, in a controlled fashion. They all get the flash in front of their eyes, and it feels like they're gonna faint. Now, if you hit really hard, that's when they actually, there is a high chance of them losing consciousness and dropping to the floor. And again, it doesn't look like much. And pulling that one off under the effects of adrenal stress does take quite a bit of training. But technique actually works quite well when you put a lot of strength and speed and power in it, and you hit correctly, and you land it well. So it's very easy to dismiss techniques. And this is something Kelly Warden said a long time ago, something along the lines of, don't dismiss a technique because of your inability to do it. I think that is very valuable advice. It doesn't matter if you try it and after training with the technique, you decide it's not for me, I can't make it work, or I don't think it's good enough. That is completely different from immediately dismissing something on sight. Now, if, for instance, and the big example that I give is mixed martial arts. Why? Well, that is a dominant combat sport right now. When I was a young man, it was things like boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai that were coming up, and those were the benchmark sports for martial arts. Back then, 40 years ago, people were saying like, well, if you're karate, kung fu, whatever is so great, why don't you step in the ring with a kickboxer and a Muay Thai guy? And today, it's the people who love MMA. And again, this is me as an MMA coach and practitioner saying that now MMA is that benchmark. And that's what people say, like, if your stuff's so good, go do it there in the octagon. It's beyond the point. I mean, if you find this difficult to believe, do this thought experiment and switch it around. If your MMA stuff is so lethal, why don't you go do it on the battlefield? Why don't you go do it in a war zone? See what happens. And it's a silly comparison. I mean, but the thought experiment is meant to open your eyes to the idea is that techniques have a time and a place and a context in which they are best used. And if you can understand that, then a lot of stuff that you might otherwise discard can actually make sense and be helpful. Right, that's pretty much it. So that was Zachariah's response. I think it's a great response, and I'll do some more along the lines of this question that was asked about that I asked about what is something that you would like people to understand about your style and that typically don't. I think this is a great example, and I'll continue doing these because I received a bunch of answers on this question that I found very valuable, and I hope you guys listening will find it useful as well. Again, as always, like, share, subscribe. Hit me up on Patreon where you'll find a bunch more stuff. And if not, I'll just talk to you next time. Okay, bye-bye.